St. Augustine. The big parking lot, but they have no place to park a motorhome. So the advantage of a Class C motorhome is you just pretend you're a car. We had to back in because we're hanging over the sidewalk a couple feet, but otherwise we're parked fine.
Do you have your ID on you, ma'am?
So this used to be the moat, but they filled it in because they didn't want the building to fall down. Oh, and there's another drawbridge here.
No, I'm not putting this stuff on. Watch out. I want to carry it.
And then I bought my own socks. I bought my own shirt. And I was in
And
the
this
process
is the door.
of getting the vest, but I was the only woman getting there, and the men were getting really nasty. So they
Definitely an interesting place.
What's this room?
But my name is Jim Purdy. I'm one of the volunteers here at the fort, and I'm going to tell you the story of St. Augustine during the Spanish colonial period. I call the program Foundations of Fire, Faith, and Blood, because that was what St. Augustine was built upon. We start our story in the year 1585. Spain and England are on the verge of war. The King of Spain is King Philip II, the most Catholic king in Europe, and his opponent is his former sister-in-law, Queen Elizabeth I of England, defender of the faith and the Church of England. So this will be one of the early wars of religion in Europe, between Protestants and Catholics, that'll consume Europe over the next 2.5 centuries. But Elizabeth's got a problem. She's broke. Her father, Henry VIII, spent England into bankruptcy, and she knows that she is going to war with Spain, and she needs to get her hands on some gold and some silver. And she knows exactly where to find it, the Spanish Main. So she calls in her favorite pirate to go down to the Spanish Main and come back with as much gold and silver as that he can steal from the Spanish. His name was Sir Francis Drake. He's known to the Spanish as El Drake, the dragon. I play on words of his name, Drake. And Drake puts together the largest fleet of English ships ever to sail to the Americas. 29 ships with 2,300 soldiers and sailors. And they leave Portsmouth in England on September the 15th of 1585. They sail south along the coast of Spain and Africa. And the first place that Drake attacks is the Spanish Cape Verde Islands, specifically Santiago Island. And they sack and pillage Santiago Island. But they find no gold or silver. But what they do find and come away with was something that they did not want. It's typhus. And on the crossing, 300 of Drake's men will die from typhus crossing the Atlantic. They arrive on New Year's Day at Santo Domingo in today's Dominican Republic. That was Spain's capital of the New World. And over the month of January of 1586, Drake and his pirates sack and pillage Santo Domingo and come away with over 25,000 ducats worth of gold and silver. They then sail south to Cartagena in today's Colombia, which was Spain's largest port in the Caribbean. In over 2 months, they sack and pillage Cartagena and come away with over 110,000 ducats worth of gold and silver. In today's money, most historians average that to be somewhere in those two raids, somewhere around $38 to $40 million in today's currency. Drake and his fleet then sailed north towards Cuba. But as they're sailing north, his men are beginning to get sick again, but not from typhus. This time it's from dysentery, from bad water, and scurvy from a lack of vitamin C. And so they get up to Cuba and they lay anchor on the southern coast of Cuba. And Drake and some of his men go ashore looking for fresh water. They meet some of the natives and they tell the natives of their ailments. The natives say, not to worry, we have a magical plant here that'll cure all ills. Today we call it sugarcane. And they would take that sugarcane and chop down the stalks, and then they pound the sugarcane down into a liquid. And then they ferment that liquid. Today we call it rum. And to the rum they will add mint to soothe the stomach and lime for vitamin C. And it would become known as the El Drake, the world's first cocktail named after Sir Francis Drake. Today we add sparkling water to it and we call it a mojito. But Drake and his men load up their ships with barrels of El Drake and they begin to sail north along the coast of Florida. Now, we don't have any records showing whether or not they actually had their ailments cured from the El Drake. But by the time they got off the coast of Florida, they didn't care less, right? But off the coast of Florida, Drake and his men spot a Spanish watchtower somewhere along the coast. We don't know exactly where it was, but we believe it was at Matanzas Inlet, down on the south end of the island here. Drake had heard that there was a Spanish settlement somewhere here in Florida called St. Augustine, but he didn't know exactly where it was. Seeing that watchtower, he believed it must be close. So they laid anchor and began to come ashore. The watchman at the watchtower ran up to St. Augustine to sound the alarm that the English were landing. At the time, you couldn't even call St. Augustine a town, much less a city. It was what they would call a presidio. It was a military town that only had about 100 soldiers, and there were no women and children. But when the soldiers here got word that the English were landing, they loaded their cannons and they loaded their arquebus muskets and waited for the English to attack. But then the 100 or so soldiers here saw over 800 Englishmen coming up the beach. And they did what any prudent soldier would do. They melted off into the woods and into the swamps, and they left St. Augustine to Drake and his pirates. And over the next 2 days, May the 28th and 29th of 1586, Drake and his pirates burned St. Augustine to the ground. They stole everything that wasn't nailed down. They stole our treasury. And before Drake and his pirates sailed away, they even stole all of our cannons. And that really hurt. But after Drake's raid, St. Augustine would rebuild, and it would grow. And 82 years will pass to the year 1668, when another English pirate comes knocking on St. Augustine's door. His name was Robert Cyril. Cyril was down sailing around the Caribbean looking for Spanish ships to attack. And off the coast of Cuba, Cyril saw a small fleet of Spanish ships leaving Havana Harbor that were heading back to the continent. Cyril was able to stop one of those Spanish ships and board it. And on board that Spanish ship was a French doctor who had lived here in St. Augustine for several years. He was on his way back to France. And under what today we might call enhanced interrogation, that French doctor told Cyril that here in St. Augustine there was a treasury of silver ingots that had been salvaged from a sunken Spanish treasure ship right off the coast, and it was worth a fortune. With that information, Cyril seized that Spanish ship. He sailed it up here to St. Augustine. As he's approaching the harbor, he's flying the Burgundian Saltire, the same flag you see flying over the fort, pretending to be a Spanish ship approaching the harbor. Outside the harbor, Cyril fires the one cannon shot, which is the appropriate signal to send the harbor pilot out to bring the ship into the harbor. When the harbor pilot went out and boarded the ship, he was surprised to see they weren't Spanish sailors at all. They were English pirates. But with a knife to his throat, the harbor pilot brought that ship into the harbor, where they laid anchor and waited until nightfall. And that night, the night of May the 23rd of 1668, while the city of St. Augustine slept, over 100 cutthroat pirates came down off of that ship to the dock here in St. Augustine. And while the city slept, Cyril and his pirates sacked and pillaged St. Augustine once again. At the time of Cyril's raid, there are now about 700 people living here, including women and children. During the first hour of Cyril's raid, his pirates killed 60 residents of the city. Almost a tenth of the population was dead in 1 hour. And then the pirates took 70 hostages, many of them women and children, and held them as hostages until the city fathers forked over that treasury of silver ingots as the ransom for their release. But there lay the rub. There was no treasury of silver ingots. There never had been. It was just a story concocted by that French doctor, quite possibly just to stop the torture. So now we have what you might call a Mexican standoff. Cyril and his pirates control part of the town and have 70 hostages, but the Spanish have regrouped and they control the entrance to the harbor. So they have to start doing a little horse trading. And finally, a deal was struck that in exchange for the release of the hostages, the city would provide Cyril with enough food, water, and supplies to get he and his pirates back to their base at Jamaica down in the Caribbean. With the deal struck, Cyril was allowed to sail out of the harbor without being attacked. But once he was outside the harbor, he did not keep his end of the bargain. He released only those hostages that were full-blooded Spanish. Any of the hostages that had any African or Indian blood, he kept to be sold as slaves on the slave market in Jamaica. And then he sailed away, taking with him the sails off of all the Spanish ships in the harbor and the rudders off the Spanish ships. It would be almost a year before the word of Cyril's raid reached Cuba, and then from there over to Spain. But the story of Cyril's raid would have a profound effect when it gets over to Spain. At the time of Cyril's raid, the king of Spain was a 6.5-year-old boy named Charles II, and his mother, Mariana of Austria, was his regent. She was a widow of his father, King Philip IV of Spain. And when Mariana of Austria learned of the destruction that had been brought to St. Augustine by Cyril and his pirates, she was the one that decided that St. Augustine needed a bigger and a better fort. And she's the one that authorized the construction of this fort, the Castillo de San Marcos. And that decision became even more important the following year, when word reached Spain that the English had established a brand new colony just 2 days' sail north of St. Augustine called Charlestown, what is today Charleston, South Carolina. The establishment of the Charlestown colony was like an English dagger aimed at the heart of Spanish Florida here in St. Augustine, and that brought urgency to the construction of the fort. But Mariana of Austria wanted this new fort in St. Augustine to be built of stone. There had been 9 prior forts here in St. Augustine, but they had all been built of wood, and the Spanish found out that in Florida's climate, wood rots quickly. And with hurricanes and flooding and storm surges coming through, the forts just did not last. But where in Florida do you find the rock to build a fort? The biggest rock we have we call sand, except for one, a marvelous stone that only occurs 8 places on earth. And one of them happens to be the Barrier Islands that run from here down to about the Palm Beaches. It's a marvelous rock called coquina. Prior to today, who in the room had ever heard of coquina? Anybody? Anybody ever heard? A few people have heard of coquina. Coquina is a Spanish word meaning little cockle shell. Now, cockle shells are those little triangular shaped shells that when you're walking down the beach, you see a wave come in and you see those shells burrow down into the sand. Then another wave comes in and you'll see more of them burrow down into the sand. Imagine how many cockle shells are down there after thousands of years of waves crashing on this beach. And over time, they get compressed and compacted down in the sand below sea level. And then a national army of 500 British soldiers and 300 to 400 Yamasee Indians to come down and attack St. Augustine and seize it from the Spanish. He thought it was going to be a surprise attack and an easy win. But what Governor Moore did not know was that the Spanish governor here in St. Augustine, Governor Zaneta, had spies in Charlestown. And he had advanced warning when they were about to go on the march to attack St. Augustine. When Governor Zaneta got that word, he called a meeting of all the men in town. He brought them into the courtyard of this fort and he addressed them. He said, "I've received reliable information that the English from Charlestown are on the march to attack St. Augustine. I cannot protect you in your homes, but I can protect you in this fort. Go back to your homes and get your families, your valuables, and your possessions. Bring them into the courtyard of this fort, and you will be safe. So all the men went back to their homes, and they got their families, their valuables, and their possessions, and they brought them into the courtyard of the fort. And then the Spanish raised the drawbridge and closed the gate and waited for the English to attack. So while you're walking around this courtyard today, take a look at the size of it. And imagine, instead of it being April of 2025, it's November and December of 1702, a little over 322 years ago. And you and your family are huddled here in the courtyard of this fort with all your worldly possessions. And 1,500 of your neighbors with all of their worldly possessions for 51 days. Yeah, you get to know your neighbors pretty well. But Governor Moore arrived in St. Augustine, and he was the one that was surprised. He found all the houses empty with nothing to plunder. But he was even more surprised when he looked up at the walls of this fort. Governor Moore would write back to Charlestown, "We find the castle much stronger than hath been represented to us by any person." He knew that his army of 500 soldiers and a few hundred Indians couldn't possibly storm the walls of the fort and try to take it by force. So Governor Moore decided he would surround the fort, put it under siege, and starve it out. And with 1,500 mouths to feed inside this fort, food became the Spaniards' primary concern. But the Spanish in this fort knew where there was a cattle ranch over on the other side of St. Augustine, over close to the St. Johns River. But unfortunately, that also meant it was on the other side of the English lines. And one night, a group of Spanish soldiers volunteered to sneak out of the fort. They were able to pass through the English lines and through the city without being detected. And the next morning, the English soldiers were awakened by a most unusual sound. It was the sound of 163 head of cattle being stampeded through the streets of St. Augustine, through the English lines, and down into the moat of this fort. It was a dry moat. There was no water in it, so that would be where they would graze. But that 163 head of cattle gave the Spanish the food supply that they needed to withstand the siege of 1702. But Governor Zaneta, the Spanish governor, had also dispatched a courier down to Havana to tell the governor of Cuba that we were under attack. And in Havana, the governor put together a fleet of ships to come to St. Augustine's rescue. That Spanish fleet arrived outside the entrance to this harbor the day after Christmas, 1702. And that Spanish fleet caught Governor Moore flat-footed with his ships at anchor right inside the harbor. Governor Moore had to burn his own ships to the waterline to keep them from falling into Spanish hands. And then Governor Moore gave up the siege of St. Augustine. And in defeat, he and his men walked all the way up the beach to the mouth of the St. Johns River, where Jacksonville Beach is today. And from there, in disgrace, they took their supply ships back to Charlestown. But before they left, Governor Moore ordered his men to burn St. Augustine to the ground again. And once again, St. Augustine would rebuild. The St. Augustine that you see today is a St. Augustine from after the 1702 siege, because every building, with the exception of this fort, was destroyed. The oldest house in town today is the Gonzales Alvarez house down on St. Francis Street, 2 blocks south of the plaza. It was built in 1723, and it's made of coquina, just like the fort. Today it is a museum that's owned by the St. Augustine Historical Society. If you're interested in the era that I'm talking about, the Spanish colonial period, this is the place to go. They give guided tours through there, where you'll see what it was like to live in St. Augustine during the Spanish colonial period. But after the 1702 siege, St. Augustine would once again rebuild, and it would grow. And by 1737, there were almost 3,000 people living here in St. Augustine. And we have a new governor named Miguel de Montellano. Governor Montellano had a very distinguished military career in Spain before being appointed governor of Florida here in St. Augustine. And he is once again feeling those winds of war blowing between England and Spain. And he does not want to see St. Augustine burned to the ground again. So he begins the construction of some defensive fortifications. And one thing that he does, and to add to this fort, is he is the one that begins construction of these bomb-proof casements that we're in right now. Prior to that, during the 1702 siege, all the rooms inside the fort were made of wood. The cannons were just on the four corners. The outside walls were coquina, but the rooms were wood. Governor Zanetto begins to build these bomb-proof casements with a gun deck all the way across so that you can move the cannons across from one bastion to the other. What makes these rooms bomb-proof is what's called this barrel vaulted ceiling that you see up there. The stones up there are cut in a keystone design so that they fit together all the way around. And the weight of the stones themselves literally hold them in place. It's an engineering marvel. It's called vault, load, and thrust. The vault causes load, which is weight, but that weight causes outward thrust, where these stones would eventually start going outward unless you filled it around the outside of them with gravel made from coquina. And that's what they put on the outside of these rooms before you get to the next one, to keep them from eventually starting to move outward by thrust. And up above these rooms, they put in 4 feet of coquina gravel fill above there before you even get to the gun deck. And that's what makes them bomb-proof. And as we found out over the last couple of hundred years, it makes them hurricane-proof too. But Governor Montillano would complete the rooms facing the water before the English attacked again. The rest of the rooms, as you see them today, were completed over the next 15 or so years. And war did come in 1739. And what a really cool name for a war. The War of Jenkins' Ear. Robert Jenkins was an English sea captain sailing from Jamaica around the coast of Cuba to get the Gulf Stream to go back to England. As he was going around Cuba, his ship was stopped by a Spanish Coast Guard vessel. The Spanish were allowed by treaty to stop English ships to search them for contraband. If they found so much as one Spanish doubloon on an English ship, they could seize the entire ship and all of its cargo. Today we'd call it legalized piracy is what it was. But the Spanish searched the ship high and low and found nothing. And the Spanish sea captain was beginning to get agitated because Captain Jenkins was very arrogant to him. So finally, the Spanish sea captain took out his dagger, cut off Jenkins' ear, handed it to him and said, "Here, take this ear of yours back to your king in England and tell him that if he comes over here and acts as arrogantly as you have, I'll cut off his ear too." Well, that's basically what Jenkins did. He took his ear back to England and appeared before Parliament. He showed them his ear and told them what the Spanish sea captain said. Parliament got so insulted, they declared war on Spain over Jenkins' ear. And it was basically a war for trading rights here in the Caribbean. And at the time of the War of Jenkins' Ear, there is another new English colony just north of St. Augustine, but south of Charlestown. It's called Georgia. And the founder and governor of Georgia was James Oglethorpe. And when word of the War of Jenkins' Ear crossed the Atlantic, Governor Oglethorpe decided he was going to attack St. Augustine and seize it from the Spanish. Oglethorpe put together an army of over 1,500 British soldiers to come down and attack St. Augustine. And this time, he has a secret weapon. The Royal Navy under Commodore Vincent Pierce with his fleet of 7 English warships. Or so Oglethorpe thought. Commodore Pierce was regular Navy, and he did not believe under any circumstances would a Commodore in the regular Navy ever be under the command of a mere colonial general. So we have a split in command between the Army and the Navy. And these two men do not get along, they do not personally like each other, and they cannot agree on a common strategy. But both of them underestimated Governor Montillano, the Spanish governor here. Governor Montillano knew that the English had made one fatal strategic blunder when they decided to attack St. Augustine in 1740. They did it during the summer. And he knew that if he could just hold out, nature would run its course. It's what I call the hum defense. Heat, humidity, hurricanes, mosquitoes, and malaria. And that's basically what beat Oglethorpe. Oglethorpe set up his cannon batteries over across the bay on Anastasia Island. In fact, over on Anastasia Island today, there's a city park called Oglethorpe Battery Park, where he had his cannon batteries set up. And back in 1740, there were no $1-million homes on Anastasia Island like there are today. There weren't even any trees. There was just sand, palmettos, and mosquitoes. And the British soldiers were over there wearing wool uniforms with tri-cornered hats. No shade, shooting hot cannons at this fort day after day after day in June and July. And the British soldiers began to get sunburned. Then sunstroke and dehydration set in. At night, they got no relief because at night they were being eaten alive by mosquitoes. And they began to come down with malaria and get the fever. Even Oglethorpe contracted malaria while he was here. And Commodore Pierce is out on his flagship just watching and shaking his head. He cannot believe how inept Oglethorpe's strategy is. Nothing Oglethorpe is doing is having any impact on this fort. But as the days go by, Commodore Pierce is beginning to get worried because his fleet of English warships are anchored outside the harbor. And he knows that it's hurricane season in Florida. And if a hurricane suddenly appeared on the horizon, his entire fleet would be destroyed. So Commodore Pierce finally gave Oglethorpe an ultimatum. He said, if you haven't defeated this fort by July 5th, I'm sailing away. I'm not going to have my fleet destroyed by a storm simply because you cannot come up with a good enough strategy to win this battle. The two men almost came to blows over that decision. And at the Treaty of Paris, Spain told England, we want Havana back and we want Manila back. There are two main trading bases in the Caribbean and the Far East. England said, okay, we'll give you back Havana and we'll give you back Manila if you give us Florida. And so what the English were unable to accomplish in two sieges, in 1702 and 1740, they accomplished through the stroke of a pen at the Treaty of Paris of 1763. And what for 250 years of Spanish rule had been known as La Florida would now, because of the Treaty of Paris of 1763, become the British colonies of East and West Florida, stretching from St. Augustine on the Atlantic all the way to the Mississippi River. And that ended the first Spanish colonial period. Now, before we conclude, I'm going to ask you to step back in time with me one more time. Back to 1763. You live here in St. Augustine. You lived here your entire life, as did your parents before you, and possibly their parents before them. You were probably alive at the time of Oglethorpe's attack in 1740, in that siege, because that's the length of time between 9/11 and today. You may have been alive at the time of the 1702 siege from Charlestown. Your parents certainly were. That's the length of time between the Kennedy assassination and today. The English are your sworn enemies. Not only that, you are staunchly Catholic, and they are heretical Protestants. And now, news comes from a ship coming from Europe, coming to this harbor with news of the Treaty of Paris, telling you that your home here in St. Augustine is now going to become a British colony. Over the next 6 months, every Spanish family in town packed up their belongings, boarded ships, and evacuated St. Augustine either to Cuba or to Mexico. Only two Spanish families remained. One was the representative of the King of Spain to make sure that the transition to English rule went smoothly. The second was a Spanish real estate agent. And his job was to sell the houses to the incoming English and then forward the funds down to the sellers down in Cuba and Mexico. Needless to say, you did not get fair market value for your house. Now, when we go to high school history classes in the United States, we tend to learn our history from the English perspective. For instance, we learn that Jamestown was the first English settlement in the continental United States, founded in 1607 in what is today Virginia, and that the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620 to found the Plymouth Colony in what is today Massachusetts. But our high school history books barely give St. Augustine anything more than a footnote, even though St. Augustine was here a half a century before either of those two English settlements. St. Augustine was founded in 1565. St. Augustine is the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in the continental United States. So while you're walking around the fort today, or downtown in St. Augustine this afternoon, possibly stopping in at one or two of our establishments to have an El Drake or a mojito, just keep in mind, you are in America's oldest city. But thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.
All right, guys, I need you to stay here on this side. Can we take the pictures from up here?
Guys, bring it up. Bring it up.
Right past the line there, the entrance to the park is the quarry, the old quarry. And then there's Curry Quarry. No, I'm not. We are too. You're actually not.
Protecting the fort. I don't want to say anything, but it's not quite straight.